The election is over. And, as I'm sure you know by now, it was a Labour landslide. Keir Starmer's party have formed the new government. Rishi Sunak's Conservatives have formed an orderly queue for the exit. I'm Niall Paterson, and on this edition of The Daily, well, if you're looking for the story of the night, I'm afraid you've come to the wrong place. Instead, we want to examine what the next 5 years will be like in a parliament stuffed with agitators and disruptors. Yes, Labour have a huge majority. Yes, the Tories had a historically bad night. But so too did the SNP. Compare and contrast, the Greens, Reform, and most of all the Lib Dems. Well, they've returned to Westminster in numbers even they find hard to believe. Yet remember, turnout was down, and there is a broader dissatisfaction with politics that the new PM will need to be mindful of. Here's Sir Keir speaking outside number 10.
Politics can be a force for good. We will show that. We've changed the Labour Party, returned it to service, and that is how we will govern. Country first, party second.
So, are we in for a bumpy few years? Let's find out. Joining us, Sky's political commentator and, once upon a time, my boss, Adam Boulton. Adam, your initial reflections?
Yeah, great to be with you, Neil. Look, this is a sensation because we only get changes of government from Labour to Conservative or the other way about every 15 years. That's how long it takes the pendulum to swing. We have had a change. We've also had a massive Labour victory, but it's a peculiar victory. The psephologists were drumming into my head this figure of 10.7%, the swing from Labour to Conservatives, which Labour needed to get just one extra seat. Now that, as it happens, mathematically, is the swing in the vote that Labour got last night, but they've got a majority of 174, not a majority of 2. And that just shows that the old rules of politics aren't playing. And the reason why they're not playing is because this election saw the smallest ever vote for the two main parties put together, mainly because the vote on the right between the Conservatives and Reform was split. And as a result, a normal two-party politics has kind of disappeared out the window at a time, ironically, when Sir Keir Starmer has a massive mandate. So we are in a completely new landscape.
Uncharted territory, certainly, but already people have been identifying this in terms such as the revenge election, pointing perhaps to the low turnout and some dissatisfaction with Sir Keir Starmer as an individual, saying that this was perhaps a loveless landslide. I mean, do you see a bit of truth in that?
Well, late last night, I was walking past a pub on my way to catch the exit poll, and I passed a lady having a fag outside a pub talking to her mates, and she said as I was passing, I really don't care who wins, provided it's not the Conservatives, to be honest. And I think if you wanted to sort of have one person summing up the mood of the electorate, that is clearly what it has been. Yeah. There's been a lot of tactical voting, but there have also been people willing to go with fringe parties, if I can call them that, Reform, the Green Party, all of whom have made significant gains. And we've also had this interesting vote of what I would call pro-Palestine independence, including, of course, Jeremy Corbyn, the former Labour leader. So people have felt free, provided they weren't voting for the Conservatives, to vote for who they wanted. And ironically, possibly the main beneficiary of that has been the Liberal Democrats, who are now back as the third force at Westminster.
Clearly, tactical voting did take place. But wasn't this as much a vote against governments, against governance? I mean, obviously, in Westminster, you have the Tories, not getting wiped out, but as near as damn it. The SNP in Holyrood, again, huge losses for them last night. This has to be something that Keir Starmer is mindful of as he enters government for the first time.
Well, he's certainly mindful of it because, of course, he's put at the top of his agenda, as he puts it, country first, party second. He's also talked about restoring probity, that he won't tolerate any sort of moral failings on behalf of his ministers. He said he would be happy to sack Rachel Reeves if she was out of line. So he set the bar pretty high to try and restore confidence in government. And it is going to be a battle. And as you say, yes, there has been a swing against governments. One of the things that I think highlights that it's personal is, right, Rishi Sunak led the Conservatives to their worst ever result. Yeah, we knew that. But what else happened? Well, the 4 previous prime ministers to Rishi Sunak, in their constituencies, the Conservative Party lost. They lost in Boris Johnson in Uxbridge and Ruislip. They lost in Norfolk with Liz Truss. They lost in Witney, the former constituency of David Cameron. No, Theresa May in Maidenhead. They lost that seat as well, which is almost amazing.
You now have a Labour Party, facing, as you've pointed out, an emaciated, official opposition, enjoying a very significant majority, 1997 size. What does that do to Sir Keir Starmer? Can he be as bold as he would wish to be? Does he need to be mindful of anything when he has such a commanding lead in the House of Commons?
Well, he should be able to get just about any piece of legislation through Parliament that he wants to come forward with. But as we were all reporting during the election campaign, all those things were relatively modest, and it doesn't appear that the policies as laid down are going to be transformative for Britain. So the question is, over this very secure 5-year term, which he appears to have with his majority, can he bring forward some transformative policies? And the answer is, at this stage, we don't know. They certainly haven't been revealed by the Labour Party during this election. And what we do know is that Keir Starmer is already saying he expects the going to get tough. He said that this morning. And he is going to go slowly. He's not going to rush forward new policies. So it doesn't look like we're going to see the equivalent of what Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did when they won in 97 of independence for the Bank of England, extra tax on banks. Doesn't look like they're going to be kind of rabbits out of the hat. Certainly not before the autumn, which is when we're told we're going to get Rachel Reeves' first budget.
Does Sir Keir Starmer need to be quite as mindful as he has been in opposition about the left of his party? You look at what took place last night. Jonathan Ashworth, Thangham Debonair losing their seat on the Gaza platform, and elsewhere around the country of Jeremy Corbyn, of course, returning to Parliament as an independent. Does Sir Keir Starmer, given the size of the majority, need to worry at all about that aspect of the party whilst in government?
Well, I don't think his war on the left is going to stop. I mean, he's got some pretty determined people around him. They will take any opportunity they can to further crush the left within the party. And in a sense, the fact that Jeremy Corbyn is outside of the party almost makes it easy. But Rebecca Long-Bailey and Richard Bergen, they're going to have to continue to tread pretty carefully if they don't want to lose the whip. On this question of Israel-Palestine, it is one which certainly arouses a lot of emotion. It is one where Labour has clearly paid a price in areas where there are a lot of large Muslim section of the population, although, of course, we should note that George Galloway was defeated in Rochdale. And in the end, I think that this is something that to demonstrate that he is a national leader who's going to put the national interest first.
Well, let's consider all that a little bit more fully with our correspondent Greg Milam. He is in Leicester South, of course, being the seat that Jonathan Ashworth lost to a pro-Gaza independent last night. Now, we knew that there was going to be pressure, Greg, but to lose not just John Ashworth, but also Thangham Debonair suggests there could well be trouble ahead.
It is, and I think in many ways the focus on Gaza had faded naturally towards the end of the campaign because everyone was focused on the election itself. But I think it shouldn't be a surprise that the anger that existed out there among Labour voters, traditional Labour voters, was very real and resurfaced when it came to actually voting. I think Jonathan Ashworth, a man who was so familiar, having been one of those people who would go to the TV studios in the morning and tell us what Labour would do if it got into office. Well, here it is. It's in office, but Jonathan Ashworth won't be there. I think that's striking that it is such a well-known face of the shadow cabinet who has lost here by less than 1,000 votes, but to a candidate, Shawkat Adam, who made a strong point of the fact that Jonathan Ashworth hadn't backed a ceasefire in Gaza and talked about that as the main issue on his campaign. Clearly had a significant impact here in Leicester South, but there were candidates in a number of areas, in British Muslim communities, areas with a lot of young voters, where that issue was still cause for concern when it came to putting their X in the box.
And one has to presume that as long as the Israel-Gaza conflict goes on, the more this will be an issue for Labour to deal with. But I suppose there is one crumb of comfort for them, and they can find that in Rochdale. George Galloway, obviously standing for the Workers' Party, trying to hold on to that seat. He indeed lost, though, to Labour, to Paul Waugh, in a constituency which you could have argued could have gone the way of Leicester South, Blackburn, Birmingham, Perry Barr, Dewsbury.
I guess for Labour, there will be the point in this of whether that illustrates this was an issue of a protest vote, that George Galloway won on the back of that strength of feeling, but that clearly wasn't enough to sustain through another election. We've got Jeremy Corbyn, of course, who campaigned very heavily on the issue of Gaza, was expelled from the Labour Party, but was able to keep his seat as an independent, beating the Labour candidate, and remains a high-profile figure on the left who will undoubtedly keep this issue in the minds of many Labour voters. The experience of Jess Phillips, another very high-profile Labour figure, of course, who only won her seat by 700 votes against a candidate from George Galloway's Workers' Party, who was booed and jeered when she gave her victory speech, who talked about the aggression of the campaign, thanked the police, said she couldn't take her children to the count last night because of that aggression. Wes Streeting only just held on to his seat in Ilford North against a British Palestinian candidate, Liane Mohammed, who had said that the comments by Keir Starmer on LBC, those now infamous comments on LBC, that he tried to clarify later, turned her against the Labour Party. And that those are figures, young figures, she's 23 years old, young figures in the Labour movement who are still very vocal on this issue. And even though Keir Starmer's handling it now as Prime Minister rather than leader of the opposition, it's clearly an issue that he has to handle.
Thanks, Greg. Well, let's focus then for a while on the Conservatives. And Adam, by anyone's reckoning, last night was a disaster. Significantly reduced in numbers, about to crash headlong into a change of leader. I mean, what do they actually have to do now in opposition as a priority? I mean, presumably, first things first, sort out the leader.
Well, do they? I mean, there's a lot of talk about a caretaker leader, similar to the way in which Michael Howard took charge of the party, never really seen as having a long-term future. He did lead them through one election, but crucially he identified David Cameron and George Osborne as the next generation of leadership and managed to deliver that. And, you know, given the scale of the defeat and, as you say, the divisions within the Conservative Party, you don't have to go very far before you find Conservatives who say, well, it looks like we're going to be out for 10 years at least. So to a certain extent, we can afford to take our time. That said, there are always rising politicians who are in a hurry. So it seems to me that what is likely to happen is, as you say, Rishi Sunak says he's going to stay on. It wasn't quite clear how long. He was saying until the mechanisms are in place to choose a new leader. He wasn't actually saying he was going to stay on until a new leader is chosen. And that will certainly take some weeks, quite possibly into the autumn. In the meantime, the diminished parliamentary party, as you say, has to decide what rules it's going to take in terms of choosing its leader. Because the 1922 committee, which represents the parliamentary party, can set the rules. Until now, since William Hague was leader, the party has basically put forward two candidates and then said it's up to the membership to choose. Now, we know that membership is declining, is getting older, and is reform sympathetic. If we look at the parliamentary party and those people who survived from the cabinet, there are a lot of people who one might call moderates who are there. For example, there's Jeremy Hunt, remarkable personal achievement, him winning. There's James Cleverly. There's Tom Tugendhat. People who would not be happy to see the party go back under Soila Braverman or
Nigel Farage.
Or Kemi Badenoch or whatever.
Well, I was checking the odds this morning, Adam, and Nigel Farage is the fourth place favourite to be the next leader of the Conservative Party.
Well, Nigel Farage has said he wants to be the opposition to Labour by the next election. And frankly, I think he'll take whatever he can get. If that means taking over the Conservative Party and he sees an opportunity, he'll do that. If that means trying to appeal to those Brexit reform voters outside the Conservative Party, and that puts him in a stronger position, I think he'll go that. I mean, he's clearly a menace, and it's quite clear that there is a split in the party between people who are sympathetic towards him, like Soila Braverman, like Danny Kruger, who was saying this morning that he pretty much agreed with reform's ideas and the task was to unite the right, and those people to whom One Nation Tories, by and large people who voted Remain, who see that as absolute anathema. So, and the other thing that perhaps hasn't been commented on is that people who were experienced and seen as the next generation of the Conservative Party, including Rupert Harrison, who was the advisor to George Osborne, Nicky da Costa, who was a close advisor to successive prime ministers, they didn't get elected. It was expected they were in safe seats, they were going to be elected, they were going to be part of the powerhouse of the new party. Let's put it this way, the Conservative Party and those who say the only way to win from the centre are not in a happy place at the moment.
That said, is there nowhere within Conservative ranks some of that kind of Tiggerish optimism, just simply because of low turnout? And I keep seeing some people describe as the softness of the support for Labour. Yeah,
well, it's quite clear a lot of the Tory vote stayed at home. Some of it went to reform. And some of it did go tactically to the Liberal Democrats, and there were even some straight transfers, as we saw with some of the big donors, from the Conservatives to Labour. That has all happened, and you can say at one level, oh, well, there's fertile territory for us to reanimate that vote. But the other problem is there's no guarantee you'll ever get it back.
Adam, thanks for the moment. We'll be back soon with much more analysis on what we should now expect following one of the most tumultuous nights in British electoral history. Welcome back. Alongside me, Adam Boulton, our political commentator. Now, Reform have but a handful of seats, but they were certainly one of the stories of the campaign. Nigel Farage, say what you like about the man, but he does have this, I suppose, rather impressive ability to persuade millions of people to vote for a party that is barely a skeleton backroom staff. I just wonder, when he ends up sitting on the opposition benches, will he be more of a thorn in Keir Starmer's side or whoever ends up leading the Tories?
I think you're absolutely right to talk about Nigel Farage rather than the Reform Party. Whether people like him or hate him, I think he is the most consequential British politician this century. I don't think the Brexit referendum would have happened, let alone the Leave vote, if it hadn't been for Nigel Farage. And he's had the impact where they've got, 15, 17% his party have nationwide. I don't think his party matters particularly to Nigel Farage. I think we're going to see now a fresh discussion about proportional representation, pushed by Nigel Farage, who, of course, has been the beneficiary of proportional representation all his career as a member of the European Parliament. I think he will make that argument. If it succeeds, well and good. That has to be good for Reform and the other small parties. If it doesn't succeed, at that point, the sense of grievance may motivate him to say, well, if you can't beat them, join them and move towards the Conservatives.
Well, look, certainly we know he's not universally popular. Nigel Farage found this out himself a little earlier when speaking, or at least trying to speak, a stone's throw from Parliament.
As I was saying, on the 3rd of June, I decided that I would not. Boring.
Sky's Tom Cheshire is in Mr Farage's seat of Clacton in what looks very much like a beer garden, appropriately enough. Tom, look, Nigel Farage will clearly be pretty happy, very happy, in fact, with what happened last night. But look at the number of votes compared to the number of seats. And you can understand why Reform has been banging that proportional representation drum throughout the campaign.
It looked like it was going to be even better, even a happier night for Nigel Farage when it was 13 seats from that exit poll. 4 in the end, being the third most popular party across the country. I think they're entitled to say, well, look at this. And it's not just because of first past the post. We know how the system works. Every party is playing the same rules to it. It's the fact that the vote share for the two main parties was low. It's been getting lower and lower. And you've got more people going for parties like Reform, but also the Greens, also the Lib Dems, also the Independents had a really, really strong showing in it. So there's a sense that, well, maybe, we have been a two-party system for a long time, but actually we're now a multi-party democracy, and that's not being reflected in it. And there's not much appetite for either the Conservatives or Labour in terms of that popular vote. Perhaps that does need to be looked at. On the other hand, the party that wins is hardly likely to change any of that.
Indeed, but when you're polling double digits and only getting seats in the single digits, I suppose it does rather serve to sharpen the mind, but it does provide a rather decent foundation as Reform moves forward through the next 5 years of this Parliament. To what extent, though, Tom, was the success that Nigel Farage has enjoyed, and to what extent is this broad support that they seem to have across the country due to their online game?
Online, it was a sensation, and that was on sort of all different sorts of places. They always had a good game on TikTok. They actually, Reform had the biggest following on TikTok before this election started, which might be a bit strange. But actually, if you look at some of the demographics of this, there does seem to be that young contingent that went for Reform in a way that we have seen in sort of the continent when it comes to France or Germany. Young people going for parties on the populist right, I think it's fair to characterise it in that way. And that goes for other groups as well, sort of Telegram, closed groups, things like that. It really did light up. It really sort of... And there's, again, that dissatisfaction with what was being offered perhaps by the Conservatives or by Labour. This felt a bit new, a bit different, a bit subversive.
But speaking directly about Nigel Farage, I mean, he has to remember that he is a constituency MP. Yes, he's leading a party. Yes, he's the second Reform MP to ever be elected. But he's still got a job to do where you are, doesn't he?
Yeah, and I think this isn't just, swapping these sort of pub benches here for the benches of Westminster. It is his constituency now. He has to look after that and sell that. And sell the idea of Reform as actually, we win. If we win in places like Clacton, if we win in places like Ashford, we will look after our constituents. That becomes a very powerful message. And that fits into Nigel Farage's programme of trying to turn this into a national movement, as he says it, build on and go after Labour, not the Conservatives, go after Labour.
Tom, many thanks. Well, look, I suppose we should talk about the third largest party in the Commons, the Lib Dems. And you can say what you like about their campaign, but they got noticed and got rewarded for being noticed. I'm just wondering what they do now as third largest party and with, for example, those questions that they'll get at PMQs.
I've been thinking about this, and what we saw Sir Ed Davey do during this election campaign to a certain extent was reminiscent of what the late Paddy Ashdown did so successfully when he was party leader, which was to choose issues which kept him in the public eye. And we've already seen Ed Davey do that in the course of this election campaign. Of course, he's done the stunts, the bungee jumping and the...
It's been great fun.
So that's, completely come out of the blue, something different, and it's kept the word Liberal Democrat, and Ed Davey talked about. He also has focused very personally on this issue of caring and carers. It's also interesting to ask yourself, where do the Liberal Democrats stand? I mean, I was talking to Polly Mackenzie, who used to be an advisor to Liberal Democrat leaders, and she was saying, well, the Liberal Democrats may actually decide that the best position as far as the public is concerned is to take on the Labour government from the centre-right rather than from the left, and to occupy the space in the centre-right, which, to a certain extent, Reform and the Tories, if they go to the far right, will have vacated.
What of Scotland, Adam, and the SNP? I mean, not a complete wipeout, but as near as damn it, and it does feel that the grip, the very firm grip that the SNP has had on Scottish politics for a very long time hasn't just loosened slightly. I think they've lost their grip on Scotland.
To a certain extent, I think we might see the nationalists arguing, well, we've lost our prominence at Westminster, all the more reason why we should have independence. But I think John Swinney has done a credible effort to stabilise the party.
Yeah.
But I think he's made one fatal mistake, which was his declaration that if he got a majority of MPs at Westminster, in Scotland, that was a mandate for independence. I mean, he spelt it out like that. Instead, he's lost, I think, 40 out of 48 MPs. You know, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. He has not got a mandate to pursue independence. So in that sense, it is back to square one, I think, for the SNP. Although I think probably the main reason why they've lost is the same reason as the Conservative Party lost, been in power too long, exhausted.
In recent years, Scotland has become quite used to seeing our politics go in one direction and then massively in the other. So I'm certainly not ruling it out happening again in the not too distant future. But just a word from you, Adam, on the demographics of this Parliament and the way in which that might change the tone of debate. I mean, the most women that there will ever have been in a Parliament, I think roughly 260, 40% of the House of Commons will be female. But also on top of that, perhaps the highest number of newbie MPs, first-timers, coming into the Commons as well.
Yeah, and interestingly, according to Michael Crick, the greatest number of gays in Parliament, something like a fifth of MPs. In a sense, this is a Parliament moving into the 21st century, really almost for the first time. And what we do know is that the assumptions about the voting preferences and the political preferences of the rising generations, you know, the under 25s, can't be taken for granted. There's a significant minority who appear to be quite attracted by authoritarian policies, for example. Or
surprising amount, in fact, yeah.
Or authoritarian parties. So again, I think this is going to contribute to the volatility of politics in this country. As we've seen in this election, you can't really talk about a safe Tory seat or a safe Labour seat anymore.
Yeah, that's true.
So the rise of the younger generation, if you like, in politics is appropriate, but it does generate, I think, a level of uncertainty. And then on top of that, it'll be very interesting to see how quickly Labour moves on its election pledge to introduce votes for 16 and 17-year-olds.
Is that volatility now baked in to our political system?
I think at the moment it is. I don't think you can say that this is something which will last forever. But, you know, let's look at it. 5 years ago, Boris Johnson got a stonking Conservative majority, bringing together Red Wall and Blue Wall and all the rest of it. This time round, that has completely collapsed. And a party like the Liberal Democrats that was flat on its back is back in the game. Party like the SNP that seemed to have established a hegemony in Scotland is out. Politics has not settled again. And, you know, crucially, politics has not settled again in the rest of the world. You know, our near neighbours in France, they're having to contend with what would have been seen as the radical, the extreme right in the form of the National Rally. We've got President Trump looking likely to be re-elected. I mean, I'm not predicting this because to a certain extent the UK got in first with the Brexit vote, but it may be that one of the stories beneath the surface of a Labour government is going to be the strengthening of the radical right in this country.
Thank you, Adam. A change of direction of this nature, of this scale, will inevitably lead to a bit of a bumpy ride. And it's worth bearing in mind that when, like Labour, you want to hit the ground running, new governments take time to find their feet. The size of his majority means the new Prime Minister does have some breathing room. But as Sir Keir Starmer is about to find out, getting elected, well, that's the easy bit. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again next week.